Hi, welcome to the 2021 Virtual Esri Developer Summit, and thank you for attending this technical session, the Cloning Apps and Items with ArcGIS API for Python. My name is John Yaste, and I'm a product engineer with the API for Python team, and I'll be presenting with my colleague Raul Jimenez Ortega, an innovation manager with Esri España. We're both going to talk to you today about different alternatives for cloning content from one organization into another. In the first part of this demonstration, we'll describe to you a scenario that we're often asked about for cloning content, then jump right into a demonstration, cloning hosted feature layers and web maps to see the clone items function in operation. Then we're going to take a deeper dive into the function and zone in on a couple different parameters that allow control of the output. And then the first part of the presentation will end with a cloning demonstration for dashboards and a web mapping application, both of which consume a web map. So we're often asked about the scenario of cloning content from a staging system to a production system. A staging system has been set up with a lot of content until it's an entire platform of layers, web map, and supporting items that have been built upon, developed, and tested that need to be moved into a production system ready for use by the general public or the customer base or the rest of the organization. So we're going to talk to you today about getting content from one organization into another. And often this scenario involves moving from staging to production. So without further ado, let's move into a demonstration of how the function works. So I'm going to move into my Jupyter Notebook environment and fire off this notebook, and let's move through it cell by cell to see what the cloning items function does. First, I import the GIS class and make two connections to two different organizations. One's going to serve as my source, which has content I want to clone, and the second is going to serve as a target where I'm going to clone my items into. So I've made those two connections, search for a feature layer, take a quick look at its item representation, and then print some information about that particular layer. And I take note of its item ID and the URL endpoint of this organization. And then I want to visualize the layer so that I can make a quick comparison of the output once I clone it. So let's take a look at how we set up the clone function. The function is called clone_items, and there is a required parameter named items, which must be a list. Whether I'm cloning one item or many, it must be entered as a list. So I organize my output into a folder and print information from this output. And I see that my layer has a new item ID and is hosted at the URL endpoint native to my second organization. And doing a quick visual comparison, I see that it looks the same as my source content. So that's cloning a feature layer. Now let's move on to a couple examples of cloning web maps. Again, I'm going to run my notebook, and then let's move through it cell by cell to see what happens when we clone web maps. Again, I'm importing some different libraries that I'm going to use, and then I set up my source and target organizations. And then let's get a web map from our source, take a look at its item representation, use the web map class to represent the web map so that I can print out information about the layers within the web map. In this case, I have one layer named Liverpool District Boundary _GBR, and I take note of its item ID and the endpoint in the organization where it is hosted. And then just for verification purposes, I'm going to search for it in my target, and I see that layer does not exist there. So now let's clone the web map. And again, I set the function up with the web map item as input. I'm organizing it into a folder. And let's take a look at the output. I see that both the featured layer and the web map were cloned. And so let's take a look at the resulting web map just for some visual and informational verification. I get the web map item, whose item representation looks the same as my original item. Then create a web map object and print the information about the layers within it. I see a different item ID hosted at a different organization with the same layer name. And now when I search my target organization, I do get return results. So there we see cloning a web map also clones the feature layer within it if it doesn't exist in the target. Now let's look at a second scenario for cloning web maps. This time I'm going to use a web map that contains the layer that was in the web map I just cloned. So here I've got a web map making use of that same boundary layer that I looked at before. Let's again create a web map object from it and print information about the layers. Here I see this map has two layers. This one is named the same as my district boundary layer from before, and I have a different layer of historic buildings in here as well. So let's search my target organization for these two layers. See that I do not have the historic buildings layer, but I do have the district boundary layer. So now let's see what happened when we cloned the web map. If we take a look at the results, I can see that the historic buildings layer was cloned and the web map was cloned, but that district boundary layer that already existed was not cloned. So let's take a further look at this web map for verification. Here I see my item representation looks identical to my original source item. Let's create a web map from the results of the cloning function. And I see the output looks the same, just both my layers are now hosted in my second organization. So we can see that cloning a web map that contains feature layers that already exist in my target didn't duplicate the content. And now I see in my target, both my layers do now exist in my target organization. So let's move on to a deeper dive into the clone items function itself to see how this operates. Let's take a look at how we access the function. So the clone items function is a method on the content manager. Anytime we make a GIS connection, there's a content property, and on that, which returns a content manager, and from there, I can access the clone items function. The clone items function, the API reference representation is here, and I see that it has a number of different parameters, and there's a brief description of what the function does. Let's talk about two parameters in particular. I'm going to talk about the search existing items parameter and the item mapping parameter. Search existing items has a default value of true, and the item mapping parameter is an optional dictionary that you can make use of. Let's first talk about search existing items. So I mentioned that its default value is true. And if you think back to the demonstration I just gave, we didn't explicitly mark this parameter in either of the demonstrations that we did. But what search existing items does is when it's set to true, it'll take a look at the item you're cloning and look within it as well, and then see if there are any items that exist in the target that match items that are in your source. And the way it does this is it looks at the type keywords property. So anytime you clone an item, a keyword is added to the cloned item. That keyword's in the format of the literal word source followed by a dash, and then the item ID of the source item is appended to that. So any item that is cloned has a type keyword of source dash with the original source item ID. And this way, the clone items function can search the target organization for whether any of the items in what you're cloning already exist, and it will not duplicate that content. And we saw that in action in our second example of the web map when the clone items function did not duplicate that district boundary layer, but instead rewired the resulting cloned web map to make use of the item with the type keywords matching the source item ID. The other parameter I want to discuss with you is item mapping. The item mapping parameter is formatted as a Python dictionary with a source item ID value as the key and a target item ID value as the value. So this applies for scenarios where you have a source item and you already have a target item that you may want to use instead of keeping a reference to the source item. This is really useful for items that are comprised of other items, things like web mapping applications and dashboards that we'll take a look at cloning later on in this presentation. The clone underscore items function does not automatically clone all the items comprising some of these more complex item types. So to witness how this item mapping parameter works, let's move on to cloning a dashboard and a web map application so we can see how these parameters work. Let's move into my Jupyter notebook environment and fire off this notebook, and again walk through it cell by cell to examine how the clone items function works. So I import the libraries I'm going to use and make my connections to both my source and target organizations. Now I'm going to search for an ArcGIS dashboard item. And here I have one return that's rich item display. And I'm going to get the dashboard definition using the getData function. The getData function returns a dictionary, Python dictionary, representing the data component of that dashboard. So I can list out the keys of that dictionary. I see that it has a widgets key, which is what I'm interested in. And then I see the types of widgets in there, and I see that there's a map widget. And let's print out the map widget definition from the dashboard. I see here the item ID of the map that's used within that dashboard. And then I want to get that web map item in my source. There I see its item representation. And next what I'm going to do is make use of that type keywords property mentioned in the description of the search existing items parameter. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a list of all the web maps in my target organization. And here I see the list, a full list of web maps from that organization. So I'm scrolling through to the bottom of that list, and now I want to search through that list to see if the web map used in my dashboard exists already in the target. And I didn't get any results from these lines of code that I've run, which query whether that web map in the dashboard ID exists in the target. And I see that it doesn't. So next I'm going to follow the same workflow that I did before when I cloned a web map and use the clone items function with the web map variable as in the items input list, and then take a look at what resulted in my output. So that web map contains a feature layer, and then I see that the web map itself was cloned as well. Let's do a preview of that item representation, and we can see that it indeed matches the source representation we noted earlier. And let's quickly print out the item ID of this newly cloned web map. Now let's clone the dashboard itself, making use of the item mapping parameter. I showed you here that we printed out the web map ID of our cloned web map. And here we've created a dictionary using the source web map in the dashboard as the key and that item ID value of our cloned web map as the target. And then we're going to enter that in our item. We're going to use that as our item mapping argument. This variable that represents that dictionary is our item mapping argument. And so we saw when the output of our clone function when cloning the dashboard is we have the dashboard clone, but we don't see that the web map was cloned because we had already done that. But now let's verify that our clone dashboard is using our cloned web map. So let's get the resulting dashboard, which we see its item representation looks the same as our source dashboard. And now let's get the cloned dashboard's widgets information. Here I see the item ID of the map widget matches my cloned web map ID. Let's scroll to the end of this cell and take a look at the representation from using that item ID, and we see that the web map representation matches our source. So there we saw we to use the item mapping parameter to map a web map we cloned and use that as the map widget in a dashboard we cloned. So now let's move on to cloning a web mapping application using the same item mapping parameter. So I move into my Jupyter notebook and run this. And let's again move through cell by cell what happens when we clone a web mapping application. So I import the libraries I'm going to use, make the connections to both the source and target organization, and then I search for a specific web mapping application. Here I retrieve a web mapping application and look at its item display for a visual comparison of what I eventually am going to clone. Now let's get the actual web mapping application and look at its item definition. So I use the getData function, which returns to me this definition. And again, this is a Python dictionary. See, this has a lot of information. So the way I go about filtering through all that information is first get a list of the different key values in that dictionary. And then I want to take a look at the source item because I wasn't sure what that was. But now I see that, okay, so this is a story map application built upon the template web mapping application of a basic story map. So now I know I have that. Then I'm going to use the values key from that definition to find out what web map was used in this story map. So here I see the web map with its ID. So let's, in our source organization, let's get that specific web map. Here I see its item representation. And so next I'm going to do the same thing I did in my previous demonstration and search the target organization for any web maps that contain the item ID of this source web map so that if I don't have to clone it, I can get the ID and enter it in my mapping, my item mapping parameter. But rather than just generate a list and search through that, I've written a helper function that is going to do that for me so that I can determine if my web map has already been cloned. So using the output of the function I wrote, I can see that it's telling me my web map that's used as the source for my story map application has not been cloned. So let's further, so we know we're going to have to clone this web map. So further, let's delve into what's contained within this web map. You see that we have a lot more layers in this web map. And I've printed out the name of each layer, its URL, and if it has an item ID property, I'm also looking at that. So this is what's contained within this web map. Now what I want to do is query my target organization again to see if any of the layers that are in my web map have already been cloned. And here, looking at my output, I can see 2 of the layers from the web map have been cloned. So when I take a look at my source ID, I can see it's used here and it's used here. So these two layers in my web map exist in the same item ID in my target. Here's their target ID. So I just want to take a look at that value and then visually inspect the results of my cloned web map to make sure that the items weren't duplicated. So let's go through our cloning workflow. Here we enter the web map as the items parameter in the list, and I see my web map was cloned. Let's go through let's get that cloned web map. I see the item representation looks similar. And then let's print the information from that web map to verify that my items that I didn't want duplicated were not duplicated. And I can see that this item ID matches the target item ID that of the cloned layers. So indeed, my function works with web maps and is not duplicating content that had already been cloned. So now I have my cloned web map ID, and I'm going to set this up the same way I did for my dashboard. The source web map of my application is here. The web map of the ID of my newly cloned web map is here. Once I clone the application using that WM mapping variable in my item mapping parameter, I see my output application is cloned. And let's take a look at the actual representation of the story map is the same as it was in the source. And when I search through the story map itself for the ID of the web map used within it, I see the value of my cloned web map, which is here. And the visual representation of the item looks identical to what we observed earlier. So there we made use of the item mapping parameter to guarantee which web maps are items that our consuming web maps use. So we've just demonstrated how to clone a number of different item types from one organization into another. And there was a lot of information in that presentation. So I want to draw your attention to a guide that exists out on the developer's website that discusses a lot of what we just witnessed here. So use the cloning content guide as a resource for when you are going to take a look at cloning your own content. And don't forget to please share your feedback about this presentation, which you can do at a survey which is available at a link you'll see below the presentation. So that does it for the first part of this presentation. On to my colleague Raul, who will describe the Group Migration Manager.
Thanks, John. As my colleague just said, I'm going to explain how the group export and import operation works. I'm going to start with how the REST API works. So we first know how it works behind the scenes, and then we will move forward to understand how to use the Python API to move content from one group on one enterprise organization to another group in another enterprise organization. So something really important to keep in mind is that you need to remember that this is only for ArcGIS Enterprise, at least for now. These APIs came with the 10.8.1 version. Well, they will be compatible backwards in the future versions, but it's not there for other versions. So the goal in here is to facilitate or simplify the flow of migrating content from one organization to another, but we will see a few more scenarios afterwards. Okay. how this operation works. Well, the export operation, what it will do is to generate that export package, an EPK file, containing all the supported items. And what do I mean with supported items? Well, as you will see in the documentation, right now, these APIs support this type of files. Not every content allowed on the portal itself is supported right now, but the most common ones, or a few of them, are already available. So this will allow us to generate a package with all the content, supported content that has been shared with the group. Then what we will do is to upload that EPK file to a separate organization and run the import operation. And how the import operation? Well, after uploading that file, we will run the operation specifying the item ID of the file that has been uploaded with the EPK, or the EPK file, sorry. And after the operation, the import operation complete, it will delete the item on the file. One really important thing to keep in mind, something that is different from the workflow John showed us before, is that the items IDs from the are going to be maintained from one organization to another. And that's something we think it's really helpful in scenarios where you are, for example, deploying an application and you don't want, you are moving from dev to test environments, and you don't want to be changing item IDs all the time, which makes harder. It can produce some headaches at some points, right? Let's see now 3 scenarios where these APIs are pretty helpful. The first one is the same one John just mentioned. As we were saying, moving from deploying environments, dev to test, test to staging, staging to production. The second one is moving between disconnected environments. This is something that you could not do with the Python API on the previous manner, right? You cannot connect to a portal that is isolated on an enterprise, on an intranet from another portal in another net, right? So this is something that we feel, or we know that it's going to be used, it's being used. And the third scenario is to do partial backups. So imagine you just want to backup an application with all the content related, all the items related to that, or all the content from one department or whatever. You can share that content with that group and run the export operation, generate the APK file, download that file, and do whatever you want. Keep it safe somewhere so you have a backup just in case something gets wrong. Another consideration to have in mind about the version, the first one of the API, is that it only provides, it can be only accessed through the REST API and the Python APIs, so it is only a developer experience workflow, because we don't provide at this point the user interfaces on portal to run these operations, just only the REST API interfaces. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's not supported at this time on ArcGIS Online. Another technical consideration in here is that the export and import operations can be only run by administrators and group owners. Actually, in the 1.8.1 version of the Python API, group owners cannot run import operations either. That's something I feel that's going to be changed. And the EPK file has a limit of 5 gigabytes. And also, if you are generating an EPK file that content have web maps, for example, referencing other items, if you want the web map to be completely copied from one organization to another, you need to remind that all the dependencies must to be shared with the same group. If not, the web map won't work in the target organization properly because the content won't be copied, right? Well, how do we consume these REST APIs on the using the ArcGIS Python API? Well, a new migration class manager has been introduced on this release of the API, which encapsulates the endpoints that will allow us to run this export and import operation. So these functions are named create to run the export operation and load to run the import operation. But I think it's better to see this with an example, right? So let's start going through both organizations we are going to use in this case. The first one is mormont.esri.es, which is going to be the source organization. The second one is formacionutility.esri.es, which is going to be the target organization. Here I have created a source group, which is this one. I have created a hosted feature layer. I have created a web map, and I have created a web app. So all of them are related, right? The web map is consuming the hosted feature layer, and the web app is consuming the web map. And that's the example group I'm going to use to migrate to the other organization. Just quickly, let me show you that if I go to my content, I don't have too many folders in here. I'm going to remove this folder because this is from previous test I was doing. And you will see that after running the export operation, this folder will be automatically created, and it will contain the EPKs from every hit I do to the endpoint. So in here, we will see that I will programmatically create the group and import the content through the API. Okay, let's see a simple snippet I created to do the first run on the APIs, and then we will see a second example which is doing the same workflow but with a couple of differences. So in here, I'm going to import the GIS module, and now I have previously defined the profile source environment. So I'm connecting to my source organization. I'm displaying the message. Okay, I'm searching for the group. I'm looking for the source group developer summit, which is the one we saw in here, right? Source group developer summit. After that, I'm printing, okay, I'm going to build the APK file. As you notice here, using the dev group variable, I'm using the migration.create function. So I'm using the migration class and the method create. And I'm using a parameter called future, which, as probably you expect, is to allow me to run synchronous tasks in here. So I downloaded that package, and here it is, right? So it has been stored in a folder, in a temp folder on my disk. Okay, we can go to the documentation on the portal itself, right? For portal docs, and here you will see on 10.8.1 version, you will find these export and import pages, where you can also say which supported types are, and you can also check the parameters. As you see, this item ID list is an array you can set optionally. We didn't use it, but the async parameter was the one that we were setting to false in this case, to run the operation synchronously. Okay, now we have this file that encapsulates all these three items in here, right? So let's run the import script, or yeah. So I'm logging to my target organization. I'm adding this item to my organization, and this item, what it is the EPK file. As you see, the FP is the data, right? So I'm saying, okay, the export package contained the previous one I just created. I'm going to store that on P item. In the meantime, I will also create a group, which is going to be the one I'm going to be using for. Sorry, I forgot to change the name to this group. Okay, never mind. And this new group is the one I'm going to be sharing with the item type. So the item type is going to be shared with the group. And now I'm going to run the import operation within the group. So I'm taking the group, I'm taking the migration.load. So it's running on P item, which is the package itself. Right. So if I go here and I refresh, you will see now I have a new group, which is the 2021 backup group. Here we have the 3 items. We will check that the items are exactly the same. The item IDs, are exactly the same. 42B7 ending on D7. 42B7 ending on D7. So as you notice, these two items are exactly the same with exactly the same IDs. So this is what we promised, and this is what we got. Okay, so that's everything with this snippet. Let's see. Let's see the documentation on the import REST API. So you will see that we use only the method, but we didn't use any parameters. We have a few in here. We have a preview only, which will allow us to check what the import package have on it before cloning the content. So that's pretty useful to be sure that you are going to load content that it's the content you want. And you have also the possibility to override existing items, right? Okay, let's see this preview only in action with, well, a few more things. So I have prepared a second script, which is going to do almost the same workflow. But in this case, with a few differences. Well, in here, let's see what it does. In here, I have I'm connecting to my organization. In this case, I'm using the environment variables. Then I'm searching for the same group as before. I'm running the same function, but in this case, realize that I'm using future equals true instead of false. So this will return a job, an asynchronous job, and then I can wait in here with this. This is not really helpful on this case, but I just wanted to show that you could build more complex workflows in your script running this asynchronously. Let me run this in the meantime, so it will take some time, and then we will check what it's displaying down there. Okay, so after I'm downloaded the file, I will connect to the target organization. I'm going to run a function to remove the content from the previous execution, so we don't have any problems running this script several times. So this is for demo purposes mainly too. Here I'm doing exactly the same as we did before. So I'm adding an item to the organization. As we said, this is really important in order to be able to run the import operation. So we need to upload to the target organization the file. I need to create, in this case, I'm going to create a different group. This time the name is Target Group Dev Summit 2021. It's not backup group as we saw before. I'm sharing this new item with the group. and then realize I'm using the preview only parameter, in this case running the inspect operation. So I'm running inspect, I'm printing what it contains, the response, and then just right away I just wanted to display on the console I'm running the load item. Normally I wouldn't do that right away, but I just wanted to keep it simple and don't spend too much time on here. So the workflow exactly the same. As you can see here, the main difference with this script is this inspecting the EPK. Check this out. This is the JSON that is returned when we are running that operation, and we can see where the source portal info, where all the content comes from, the item IDs. Well, it's the metadata of the some parts of the metadata of the files that we are going to be cloning, the Spain boundaries, province app, what type of elements are on this CPK. We could even check that all the supported, well, all the types that are in here are the right ones, but well, it should. And we have finished. So if we go again to our target organization, we will find this second group. Sorry, it was in here, target group, as the previous one was on the top. So here we have the same items in here. So everything worked properly. Let me show you one last thing before, one last thing before leaving. Just on this organization, you will notice that there is also a new folder with the same name of the group you created. So we have here one for the previous run, and we will have no, we don't. A folder with the items we imported. I'm losing something, I think, because there should be a target. No, okay. And the last thing I wanted to display is, okay, as you notice here, we see, well, here or in Jupyter, we saw that we have on this temporary folder the EPK file. Let me just open this folder. Let me go in there, and here we can find, well, both EPK files we created. So if I rename or change the extension, you will see that the content on this EPK file is nothing more than the items that the group contains and some metadata related to each item. So don't do this, please, normally, because you can break the package and the import will fail. But just in case, I just wanted to let you know that it's nothing more than a zip file with the content that the API need to understand or get in order to run the whole operation. So with this, I have finished the demo. I hope this was helpful. Well, as I always like to say that there are tons of resources to keep learning about how to, in this case, clone items. As John said, there is a guide on the documentation side, but there are many other talks. You will find there are a couple of more sessions of the Python API during the Dev Summit, and we have also a playlist on YouTube where you can find a list of Python API sessions that were that took place in other developer summits. So please check those resources if you want to keep learning things. Remember that the Python API documentation is also on GitHub, and you can find on the blog all the new stuff that is coming, new versions and related projects that are really interesting and articles. So keep an eye on that. With that said, let me repeat what my colleague John said. Please give your feedback. It's really, really helpful for us to consider what's worth to keep for the next edition of the Developer Summit and keep improving it. So with that said, let's go to the questions.
Hello.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for attending the cloning session. I think the cloning and group migration manager session. We're just going to roll through the questions that came in for us. I'm John, and you can see my colleague Raul is here as well. So let's just go ahead and get started. So this first question: can only hosted feature layers be cloned? And what about a feature layer from an enterprise geodatabase? No, there's many different item types that can be cloned. And if you go to the developers.arcgis.com page and go to the Python section, and in the guide pages, there's a cloning content guide that was referenced in the presentation. There's a list of different item types that can be cloned. This second question about a feature layer referencing data in enterprise geodatabase was asked by numerous people in the presentation. It's like, if you clone a featured layer that is referencing data from an enterprise geodatabase in a source that's a data store for your source, when you clone it, it will clone the item, but the cloned item has no way of copying the data from the source geodatabase to the target data stores. So the resulting item will reference the same original data if it's coming from an enterprise geodatabase. So that question was asked numerous times. So if you, again, cloning a feature service referencing an enterprise geodatabase data store will not copy the data from the source enterprise geodatabase to any data store configured with your target.
As far as we know, it's not in the roadmap either, right?
Yes, as far as we know, if you want to ask that at the enterprise geodatabase island, they can discuss with you more the real technical difficulty there would be in doing that. So the next question is, and this one was asked numerous times as well, will the code demoed in these presentations be shared afterwards? They will. You know, the last couple slides of the presentation did mention the public repo that we have. It's at https://ArcGIS-Python-API. There is a conference talk branch in that repo, and all talks from many conferences are available there. And these notebooks and resources will be available there, and the slides will be available through the Dev Summit site. So these resources will be available to you.
Yeah, and also the notebooks and the scripts I use is in the other GitHub repository for the Dev Summit, which is github.com/Esri Dev Summit /cloning-apps. Well, if you go there, you will see the name of this session on that organization.
Okay, so the next question, I think, Raul, you said you're comfortable with this. What happens when a previously cloned item is changed between the initial clone and a subsequent attempt? If it doesn't clone again, does it update with any new settings?
No, that would do anything actually, because at the end, behind the scenes, what it is doing is just checking if the type keyword is there, if that source item has been already cloned, and if it's there, it will skip the whole process. So if you want to copy or clone the item again, you are free to do it, but you have to remove the previous one. Well, if you previously referenced that item, you will have to update also all the references.
Okay, our next question says, if there's item types that clone items has issues with, right? Clone items works on a finite set of item types, and that list of items is referenced in the cloning content guide that is at the developers.arcgis.com website in the Python section. Under the guide pages in the cloning content, you'll see a list of item types that are supported with clone items. So not everything can be used with clone items, but there is a long list that can. And our next question is it possible to clone story map / experience builder items between ArcGIS Online and Enterprise Portal if they have different embedded app versions? Yes, it is possible. You can clone those different item types between any organizations, regardless of where they're hosted, whether they're ArcGIS Online organizations or ArcGIS Enterprise organizations. You can clone between those, and the versions that you're cloning from will still clone. I think you'll just be limited to the functionality that's in your target as to how it compares to what's in the source. Raul, do you have anything to add to that?
I was thinking that maybe the only problem is that you can copy the item, but the problem is about opening, right? Because if you are using a feature that is not supported on the, well, it doesn't make sense if you are copying something from an old version to a new one. If you are doing otherwise, which doesn't make too much sense to me, could have some issues, right? Because imagine you have the latest web app builder version of an app on ArcGIS Online, and you are copying to an enterprise account which has an old version of the web app builder. So
yeah, and I think if you really want to know the ins and outs of the differences between story maps between releases and experience builder apps between releases, the Ask Our Experts island for those specific teams would be the best resources to talk to about what happens if you move one from one release to another. You move those item types between releases. And so the next question is one that we have discussed. Again, I'll just reiterate that cloning reference data in a enterprise geodatabase data store does not copy to the target organization. The target item is created with all the item information identical to the source, but it references that same source data store, enterprise geodatabase data store. So next question is, hi, will this function work for cloning web maps using map services from our local servers? No, what map services are not in that list of supported item types. So clone items does not support cloning map services.
Yeah, because at the end, we have to keep in mind that the clone items function is using the REST API of the portal itself and the ArcGIS Online. So if you don't have portal on top of it, it won't work, right?
Right. Okay, so does clone item copy all metadata over to the target? I've noticed when using the online assistant, it doesn't pull over the complete XML metadata. Clone item, yes, the clone items function is designed to copy over all the metadata, all the JSON behind the scenes in the whatever item you're copying is moved over to the target. So yes, the metadata will come over with that. Can we clone feature? I'm assuming this is host feature layer views and web app builder apps that are hosted. Yes to both of those. You can clone those types of items. Yes. And can you, the next question, this was asked a number of times too, can you clone items within organizations? Absolutely. You just need to make two different separate connections with the GIS object, and you can clone within the same organization. And so if you are cloning a web map with layers that are not hosted, but they are both in each portal, will it remap them to the proper layer? Not automatically. In the presentation, the item mapping parameter of the clone items function was discussed, and that parameter is designed to accomplish this exact thing. So if you clone an item and you have a source item that you want to use if you clone something that contains other items in a source, you can change the mapping with that item mapping parameter so that the target item references the data of your choosing. So also, will this work for Web App Builder? Clone items, yes. And does the group migration manager work for web apps? Raul, do you?
For web apps,
Yeah,
right?
I believe it does. Yeah. Yeah. So does clone items bring over embedded credentials in a feature layer or any sharing configuration? It does bring over the details of the sharing configuration, but does not bring over embedded credentials. Can you only clone items that are stored in the hosted data store? So again, I think we've covered this question multiple times, which seems like that's an issue, like that's something on a lot of people's minds. But again, you can clone multiple different item types. If the item you clone references a data store, references an enterprise geodatabase data store or some kind of data store that is not hosted, that data is not copied to the target. So the next question, can you use this cloning workflow when migrating from one version of enterprise to another? Example, going from 10.5.1 to 10.8.1. Yes, you can. You can clone items between different versions of ArcGIS Enterprise. Raul, do you want to talk about what your thoughts on what any kind of limitations there is to that?
Yeah, same thing. The only have to keep in mind. The only thing to keep in mind is that the functions you are using on the Python API uses REST endpoints that are supported for both portals, right? For both organizations, because as we were mentioning, if you try to use, for example, the group migration tools, it won't work, right? But for the typical use case, I would say, yes, it should work.
Yes, yes. Okay, so next question here says that all scripts work with profiles to log into enterprise or online. Does it work with SAML enterprise logins? So I'm going to attempt to take a stab at this. So if you've set up a profile, regardless of whether that's enterprise or online, no matter how the authentication scheme is configured, the profiles will work. So yes, yes, like these workflows that we showed in here, regardless of how you're authenticating to your organizations, these workflows will work, and you can use profiles to log into the GIS. We'll say, okay, so this question, what happened if the search item is set to false? The hosted service is republished. So yeah, if you set the search existing item parameter to false in the clone when you're using clone items, it's not going to search the target organization for that tag that will let it know that the item has already been cloned. So you just have the item will be cloned again. The next question, is this similar concept as the link to the sample notebook for cloning portal users, groups, and content? Similar in concept, yes, but if you look through those examples, you'll see that cloning users is not supported with the clone items function. So that notebook is going to show you how to get users, how to transfer users objects between organizations. Groups, like we've given you a couple, like you've seen a new option that was made available here with the group migration manager. The clone items function will clone groups, but there's also a detailed example of how to clone groups in a different way there. And we've discussed content a number of times here. There's specific item types that clone items will work with and that group migration manager will work with. So If yes, does the cloned item get a new item ID or the same item? Cloned items, the resulting target item will have a different item ID. And if it gets a new ID, does the item ID value get updated in the JSON of the web map? Yes, if you're cloning a web map that has hosted feature service, if you cloned that web map, the target web map will have a new ID, and then the target feature services that are cloned along with the web map, that web map will be configured to connect to those target feature services. It depends on what's in the item, what it's referencing.
Okay, John, I think we have time for one last question.
Okay. So we answered that one. Can I clone items inside the same enterprise? We've answered that one. Yes, you can. You want to take this one about the EPK, the last one?
Could you create an organization group? Yeah, you could do that. Just keep in mind that not all item types are still supported and the limitation of 5 gigabytes.
Yeah, and I think we are out of time. So thank you again for attending. And if any of your questions didn't get answered, please ask at the Python Island at the Ask Our Experts.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.